All right, I think we should go ahead, Craig, and get started. I want to welcome you today to the Alden Kindred of America's presentation of Plymouth Colony Architecture from the Ground and from the Book. My name is Desiree Mobed, and I'm the Executive Director. The Alden Kindred preserves and shares the legacy of Mayflower passengers John and Priscilla Alden at their homestead in Duxbury, Massachusetts, through guided tours, educational programs like this, exhibitions, publications, and genealogical research. I'd like to offer a special welcome to our members who are joining us today, whose support helps make programs like this possible. If you would like to learn more about the Alden Kindred or to support this program, we encourage you to visit our website at alden.org. Today, we are very honored to welcome archaeologist Craig Chartier for a fascinating glimpse at houses in 17th century Plymouth Colony, how they've been interpreted, and what maybe they really looked like, with a special emphasis on archaeological findings and historical gleanings from the past quarter century. Craig is well known on the South Shore of Massachusetts and Cape Cod for his work on sites that range from Paleo-Indian to an early 20th century cemetery. His specialties are bone analysis, the 17th century, and public education. Craig received his undergraduate degree from the University of Rhode Island and a master's degree from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He's worked on archaeological projects of all kinds around New England and along the East Coast down to Virginia. After or during his talk, we encourage you to ask questions by typing them into the chat or the question and answer function. If you have to leave early, we are recording this program and we'll be sharing it on the Alden website. But now let's go ahead and welcome Craig Chartier. Craig, thank you so much.
Thank you. Let me get my slideshow going here. There we go. All right. Did everyone see that? Look good? All right, excellent. So good afternoon. I'm happy to see so many people who wanted to come out and listen to me talk about Plymouth Colony architecture. Today we're going to be talking about the earliest English architecture that we have evidence of in Plymouth Colony from roughly 1620 to 1690 or so, what's identified by architectural historians as first period architecture. Let me just see. I'm trying to forward my slides. Yeah, you'd think it'd just be easy. You just got to click. Let's see. Give me one second here. You know, we made sure that we checked out that the slideshow was working, but we didn't actually check to make sure that we could forward them easily. Hmm. Let's stop that for 1 second. Let me just retry this.
So, yep, while you're getting your slides fixed, I just wanted to let you know that people are joining us as far away as California and Canada and around the country. So welcome, everybody. It's a real honor here on a snowy day in New England to be able to talk and share this with you.
That's wacky. I don't know why it's doing that. see what happens if we do that. Oh, there we go. Now I got it. Now we're good. All right, excellent. Thank you. Thank you for sticking with me. Technology, you gotta love it. Don't have to worry about it in the 17th century, right? There's traditionally three sources of information on period architecture: written records, archaeology, and standing structures. In the earliest architecture in the colony were limited to two sources: written records and archaeology, books, and what's in the ground. There's no examples of the earliest forms of architecture built by the colonists still standing in Plymouth Colony or in New England in general. These first forms were pioneer buildings, buildings designed to establish, provide shelter with a minimum of durability. They were sturdy, they were quickly erected, they were dry, they could be made warm. They were not built to last. They were built to establish with the goal of being replaced as soon as financially possible. The informal study by historians of the earliest architecture goes back to the 19th century, with the most popular idea being they lived in log cabins, just like 18th century pioneers that people in the 19th century knew. This was mostly because of a statement made by a Boston historian during the log cabin presidential campaign of 1840, basically to the effect Pilgrim Fathers' first houses were log cabin. No one knew any better. No one really appears to have worried about whether or not this was true until the tercentennial of Pilgrim's Landing in 1920, when a more serious scholarship was starting to determine what their early homes could have looked like. The log cabin interpretation was largely destroyed by historian Harold Robert Shurtleff in 1940 with his publication of The Log Cabin Myth, a study of the early dwellings of the English colonists in North America. Basically, his final conclusion was that log cabins were not built in America until Swedish immigrants came over and started building them, and that this would not be something appropriate to the 17th century. He didn't really have a lot of evidence about what would be appropriate. He was citing standing structures and kind of going from there, but he was someone who finally got rid of the idea that log cabins were the first houses, though occasionally you do still see it nowadays. The myth was challenged even earlier by avocational archaeologists, such as James Hall in 1850 when he excavated the homestead of Miles Standish, and especially by Percival Hall Lombard in the 1920s when he excavated the site of what he believed was Plymouth Colony's Aptuxet trading post in Bourne. While Lombard's interpretation of what he found could be considered rather fanciful today, at the time it was cutting edge, to the point that it was physically reconstructed on site and eventually became the model for the first house built by Harry Hornblower when he was establishing Plymouth Plantation. And you can see that on the left-hand side there. That's based on the Aptuxet Trading Post. That's one of the shops, one of the buildings that's down on the waterfront, down by Mayflower too. There's little documentary evidence of what the early houses looked like. When the Mayflower arrived, many of the passengers were sick, and the company's first desire was to get people off the ship and housed on shore. Construction of the first house began on Monday, the 25th of December, when some of the men went ashore to fell timber, to saw, and to rive. This indicates that they expected the first house to be timber framed with clapboards on the exterior. By January 9th, the common house, measuring 20 feet square, was nearly completed and only lacked a thatched roof. The common house was filled with beds so that people could leave the ship and had a chimney. On Sunday, the 14th of January, a spark from the fire flew up and caught the thatch. On Friday, the 19th, it was decided that a shed in which to keep the common provisions should be built on the end of the storehouse. This was completed on Saturday, the 20th of January, and on Monday afternoon, they began the task of moving supplies from the ship, a task that lasted several days. Another fire broke out in the common house in November of 1623 when some sailors, being housed there, probably celebrating Guy Fawkes Day by making a bonfire in the chimney, caught the house on fire. Bradford reported they broke out in the chimney into the thatch and burnt down 3 or 4 other houses, consumed all the goods and provisions in them. The house in which it began was right against their storehouse, which they had much ado to save, and which was their common store and all the provisions, the which, if it had been lost, the plantation would have been overthrown. Bradford also noted that soon after, smoke was seen rising from a shed joined to the end of the storehouse, the shed that was built in 1621, which was wasted up with boughs. In the withered leaves thereof the fire was kindled, which some, running to quench, found a long firebrand of an ell long lying under the wall on the inside, which could not possibly have come there by casualty and must have been laid there by some hand in the judgment of all that saw it. So basically, they think someone set the house on fire. But it's interesting that they say that it caught in the boughs, the sticks that were in the wall. It appears the wall of the shed was made of wattle with no daub. It was wasted up with boughs, what still had leaves on it. They just had sticks basically in there with the leaves on them. Didn't even bother taking the leaves off, and that's what caught fire. Once the common house was built, they then set about to build their town. They went to the labor in building their town, 2 rows of houses for more safety, divided by lot, the plot of ground whereupon to build their town, after the proportion formerly allotted. We agreed that every man should build his own house, thinking by that course men would make haste than working in common. A letter from Robert Cushman to William Bradford advised that because the houses would be owned by the merchant adventurers who had backed the colony, this would hinder the construction of good and fair houses, and that the point should be to build houses for the present, such houses as, if need be, we may with little grief set fire and run away by the light. These are not permanent abodes they're building. This is something quick and something that they can easily replace later. The statement, coupled with the fact that it was recorded that each person should build their own house, may have led to a variety of house forms in the village, house forms based on the individual's own English background. By 1623, there were 20 houses in the town, with 4 or 5 being fair and pleasant, as reported by a visitor named Emmanuel Altham. Constructing a house using vertical planks, as you can see in this slide here, this is an old house. These folks are having a picnic in the late 19th, early 20th century. But you can see the vertical planks that are right on the front of the house covered with the clapboards. When you construct a house with vertical planks, it was a common feature of Dutch architecture in the early 17th century, and one that appears to have been brought to New England by the colonists who lived in Holland. Building a house using vertical planks involves the use of wide sawn boards to cover a frame of widely spaced vertical timbers placed at the corners of the structure. The vertical planks are spiked to the horizontal sill, and the holes are drilled at the top plate and trunnels driven in to secure them. Frame houses require more joints than planked houses, and thus are more costly to build with regards to time and expense. Holes for casement windows were sawn possibly after the erection of the frames and were affixed to the boards. This method of construction was rare in 17th century New England, being limited in the early decades of Plymouth Colony in the northern corner of Rhode Island, which was settled by colonists from Plymouth Colony. Over 90% of the surviving structures in Plymouth Colony prior to 1725, structures that are still standing, were built in this manner. Vertical plank structures were known to have built as early as 1622 in Plymouth. When the fort on what is now Burial Hill was constructed, it was described by a Dutch visitor as being, quote, built of thick sawn planks, stayed with oak beams. The exterior of these structures were covered with clapboards, and the interiors were not plastered. In Massachusetts Bay, the agreement for building of the Meeting House in Manchester, built in 1719, specified that the house shall be planked and not studded. So it gives more evidence that this planking technique was very common in Plymouth Colony, and also up in Mass Bay to a bit. Another bit of evidence as to how the early houses were constructed comes from Bradford's writing. The colonists at Plymouth erected a structure for trading at Uptuxet on Cape Cod in 1626. This is that Uptuxet trading post that Percival Hall Lombard was looking for. And quickly abandoned the site, and they focused their trade in Maine. In 1635, Bradford described a hurricane that struck the colony and said this year, the 14th or 15th of August, being a Saturday, was such a mighty storm of wind and rain as none living in these parts, either English or Indian, ever saw. It caused the sea to swell to the southward of this place above 20 feet, right up and down, and made many of the Indians to climb into trees for their safety. It took the boarded roof of a house which belonged to this plantation at Manamet and floated it to another place, the posts still standing in the ground. So even though the storm blew down hundreds, maybe thousands of trees, the posts that were put in the ground 9 years prior remained, although the rest of the structure was gone. And this will be important, the posts in the ground. We talk about more about the architecture, especially the archaeological aspect of it. One final record of the possible dimensions of some of the early structures shows up in the Plymouth Colony records in 1642, when the town agreed with Nathaniel Southworth to build the said watch house, which is to be 16 feet in length and 12 feet in breadth, an 8-foot stud to be walled with board, and to have 2 floors, the upper floor to be 6 foot above the lower floor. And he is to batten the walls and make the small pair of stairs in it, and to frame 2 small windows below, to make 2 gables to the roof, or each side one, to cover the roof with shingle, and to build a chimney in the said house, and to do all the works thereunto, only the frame is to be brought to the place at the town's charge. And for the said work is he would have £8 to be paid, either in money or other pay equivalent. So this is a fairly small house, 16 by 12. Now, after the talk, just try measuring that out in your yard or even in your house. Even some of the rooms in my house measure that size as well. And you see, it's a fairly small house, but it was 2 stories, and it had a chimney in it, and it had a staircase in it. So even though some of these houses we're going to be talking about are rather small, they kind of built upwards sometimes, and they built with what they had basically. In Plymouth, it's known that the majority of the houses by 1627 were cottages. Emmanuel Altham reported that when he visited Plymouth in September of 1623, that in this plantation is about 20 houses, for 4 or 5 which are very fair and pleasant, and the rest, as time will serve, shall be made better. Altham's description indicates that most of the houses were not fair and pleasant, meaning they were ugly and rude, but some were better, and it could be expected that those that weren't would eventually be modified or improved. What constituted a fair and pleasant house, though? The only probate that exists for one of the original Oldcomers houses on Leyden Street is that of Governor William Bradford, who died in 1657. His wife, Alice, who died in 1670-71, continued to live in the same house after her husband's death 20 years prior. And her probate record provides additional information about the house. When William Bradford's estate was inventoried, they began in the old parlor on the ground floor. And these are all designations that they made in the probate record. Then into the great room, then into the kitchen, probably at the back of the house, then upstairs into the new chamber, then downstairs into the study, which Bradford either used as a store or at least had a storehouse for bulk goods, and then outside to finish with an inventory of the animals. The original house was probably formed the hall called the old parlor in his probate. When the house was expanded, the great parlor was added to the opposite side, would originally be the gable end wall chimney, making the house into a hall and parlor style. The roof would have been raised. The upstairs rooms, referred to as chambers, would have been added at the same time, which are not referenced in William's inventory, though they may have been set off to the widow. And they referred to as such as the old parlor chamber, the chamber above the old parlor, and the outward parlor chamber. This is in Alice's inventory. The kitchen, which apparently lacked a chamber, was probably indicated it was a shallow sloped roof lean-to. Addition on the back or the north side of the house that had been added at the same time. So it's kind of turning it. It sounds like it's like a salt box house, basically, like a Cape Cod salt box house. So what form do these houses take? The basic house of the early 17th century Massachusetts, Plymouth, Massachusetts colonists could take several forms, from the basic cottage, a one-room, one-bay, single-cell structure that often measured as small as 16 by 12 in medieval times, to long houses of around 33 by 13 feet, to the hall and parlor plan with a central or end chimney that were common in East Anglia and Old England. The cottage was typically considered appropriate for those of the lower social scale in the Middle Ages. By the time of the settling of Mass Bay, it was often found to be a starter home for colonists. In Mass Bay, the single bay cottage were common throughout the 17th century and into the 18th century. For example, a 1640 contract stipulated that a house to be built 16 foot long, 14 foot wide, the chimney framed without daubing, to be of hewn timber. Abbot Low Cummings, who did a lot of study of Mass Bay houses, 17th century houses, found that of the 79 dwellings whose dimensions were recorded in documents from 1637 to 1706, 39 were single bay cottages, with only 2 being of less than 15 foot dimensions. 17 of them measured from 20 to 28 feet long and 18 to 20 feet wide. The small houses appear to have been limited to individuals with limited means, with estates ranging from 15 to 163 pounds. It's a little cottage there. Long houses evolved out of medieval houses that sheltered both man and beast, people at one end of the house and the animals at the other end in a byre, all under one roof. They were typical medieval peasant houses that were common in many regions of England and absent in the central Midlands, East Anglia, and Kent. The differential distribution has been attributed by some in later areas' ability to produce abundant amounts of grain, which resulted in abundant straw for bedding in what were called crew yards versus inside in a byre. By early in the Tudor period, 1485 to 1603, lowland farmers had abandoned the animal byre dwelling house form of the longhouse, as a separation of domestic and industrial buildings on the farm became the norm. The longhouse form did continue into the 17th century, with portions of the longhouse that once housed cattle now being known as a back house in East Anglia. And it's interesting that when Edward Winslow sold his house in downtown Plymouth, one of the things noted in the sale was a back house. It either says back house or it says bake house. It's one of those things you can't really make it out too well in the actual description and the handwriting. But it could be back house, it could be bake house. But the back house became a combination milk room, buttery, and kitchen, or in Yorkshire, they become a general purpose storage room. The longhouse also seems to have been common house form associated with trade and storehouses in Virginia and New England. Longhouses were common at Jamestown, and the first common house built in Plymouth in 1620 may have been that form as well. Using a longhouse for trading and storage is the logical step, as it allows people to live in relative comfort in one half that contained the hearth, and goods to be secured in close proximity to the inhabitants in the unheated back house portion. Add a cellar beneath the back house, and you have a building where you can store goods that are immune to freezing temperatures, such as kettle, cloth, knives, upstairs, and keep liquids below ground where they're less likely to freeze, even in winter. Hall and parlor houses is a house that contains two rooms on the ground floor, one being the hall, the other being the parlor. The hall is the main work area of the house. It was where the kitchen was located and was used as a dining room, workroom, bedroom, and storage chamber. The parlor was invariably a smaller room and was more of an intimate setting. Parents' bed was located here, and the room itself was used for intimate dining with guests, often being better furnished and fitted out than most of the more utilitarian hall. The hall and parlor house developed from the 16th century English roots at a time when the desire for intimacy and privacy, effectively an escape from the day-to-day world, were making an appearance in wealthier English homes. One easy way to accomplish this was merely wall off a portion of your house, at a time when houses generally just consisted of a great hall where everything was done. Eventually, the parlor became an integral part of the house design, leading to later 17th century central chimney houses, with a hall on one side and chimney and parlor on the other. Earlier hall and parlor houses consisted of a chimney placed at one gable end wall. The chimney opened into the hall hearth, with the parlor being located on the opposite gable end. The stair or ladder to the upper chamber would be located against the wall of the chimney, furthest against the front from the front door. Visitors would enter a house like this directly into the hall, and then would either remain here or be invited into the chamber, into the parlor. In later 17th century houses, visitors would enter the front door and then could either choose to proceed up the stairs that would be located immediately in front of them, or turn to the left and right and enter through another door that would either be into the hall or the parlor, depending on what their business was. Common dimensions for the entire houses were between 16 to 20 feet deep and 20 to 40 feet wide. Traditionally, in East Anglia, England, stairways to the second floor were located on the back side of the chimney stack. In New England, they eventually were placed on the front side of the chimney stacks to be encountered as soon as you'd enter the house. And probably, some people may be familiar with visiting those kind of houses, such as the Bradford house that's there in Duxbury. So now we're getting into the archaeology portion of it. We've seen some of the things that are above ground. Let's start looking below ground and see those traces that actually survive. This is what's called earth-fast architecture. These are the posts that were still standing in the ground that Bradford describes. Such at the trading house, evidence that the original houses were probably built using a technique that was one time thought rare in New England. Earth-fast architecture, also called post in ground or mud and stud down in Virginia is what they call it. The posts that formed the framework of the house were originally seated within post holes in the ground. This is a construction technique where the framing members of the building are standing or lying directly on the ground, or more commonly erected in post holes. Essentially, what was done was that holes were dug where the posts would be seated. After the holes were dug, the framework for the walls of the structure were constructed on the ground adjacent to the post holes. When the wall sections were completed, they were raised up and slid into the post holes. The wall sections were secured into the adjacent wall section, and the whole framework tied together to create a box-like framework for the structure. Roof timbers were then raised on top of the walls, and the roof interior floors were framed. This is an ancient technique dating back to prehistoric times in Europe, and it's believed to be a technique used for the construction of the first houses in Plymouth, circa 1620, 1621. Carrie Carson, Norman Barker, William Kelso, and Gary Wheeler Stone and Del Upton described earth-fast architecture in the southern colonies as being an impermanent form of architecture that was inferior to frame construction, which in the early 17th century was seldom used in England and only used in extreme cases in the New World. They posited that the early settlers used earth-fast architecture as a quick and expedient way to raise a structure in the first years of colonization, but that settlers who remained in a colony would have preferred, and in many cases replaced their earlier earth-fast structures with more permanent and structurally sound framed houses when means and positions afforded it. Earth-fast architecture was used from the start in places like Jamestown, Virginia, 1607, and St. George's Fort in Maine, also 1607, and continued to be used throughout the 17th and 18th century for permanent architecture. Builders who used decay-resistant materials such as oak could expect a post and ground house to last anywhere from 30 to over 50 years. This is a very simple form that you can see here of earth-fast architecture. You don't need to have anything too fancy when you're building one of these very impermanent structures. There are three different types of earth-fast architecture: sill on the ground, free-set post, and bent-set post. Simplest way to build a structure is merely setting the sills of the building directly on the ground, nothing in between it and the earth. While this is a quick way to build a building, the sills will quickly rot. Building a structure with free posts mean that the individual posts were placed in the ground free of any other framing members. Following their planting, the upper end of the posts were trimmed to similar heights and then framed together with horizontal timbers connecting the vertical posts. The structure can be built with as few as 4 posts in this manner, one at each corner, or maybe constructed using several posts closely spaced on each side. The posts are then joined together by exterior clapboards or planks with very limited additional framing being present. When a building is constructed with closely spaced posts averaging 5 feet or less between them, because this is about the average length of a clapboard, it's said to have been built a palisado or puncheon construction, quick to build and described by archaeologists as ephemeral structures raised around a gaggle of earthen uprights. Bent setting framing involved connecting 2 hewn timbers on the ground, to posts on the ground, to a hewn horizontal member, which is the plate or tie beam, and then raising the whole assembly, referred to as a bent, up as one unit, kind of like an Amish barn raising. The post holes for the free-set post structure are generally slightly larger than the post that was seated into. The bottom depths of the post will have much more variability because the bottom depths do not matter, as the tops will be cut to length after they are set up. Holes for a bent set structure are much roughly oval and larger, averaging 4 feet or more in length, and they will be of very similar depths. This is due to the fact that when raising a bent, it must be slid into the hole and then raised up. The bent must be level when in place so that the framing for the house will not be skewed. Bent set construction requires much more forethought and planning than free set post construction, which in turn requires more planning than puncheon construction. The use of early earth-fast architectural techniques has been hypothesized providing a quick and relatively cheap way to build structures that may not have been meant to be permanent abodes. The need to quickly erect a structure that could be lived in until a time when a better constructed and more permanently built one, one that rested on a foundation raised off the ground and thus not prone to decay as quickly, may have contributed to the use of the technique during the early occupation of all kinds of 17th and 18th century sites. It's assumed the owners of the earth-fast structures would have wanted to eventually have a fully framed, fine, and fair house as their permanent home. But due to financial limitations, the death of the head of the household, or just the fact that life gets in the way of living, the buildings were not replaced until they may have gotten beyond repair. Repairs were made during the original earth-fast building's life. Posts were added and replaced, stones replaced, rotted post sections, and additions were made to accommodate for growing families, changing needs. But eventually the buildings were either purposely raised or replaced, burned down, or demolished. So as a result, we don't have any, up here in New England, we don't have any surviving post and ground structures that we know of. Anyway, I think there's one maybe down in Maryland, and maybe 1 or 2 in Virginia. That's it, like those sections of houses. But these just don't survive. The buildings are kind of like the Alden House that survives nowadays. The standing Alden House. It's built on a foundation basically, nice and permanent, obviously. Some archaeology examples now, getting down and dirty, I guess. The first officially identified earth-fast house in Plymouth Colony was the C21 Allerton site in Kingston, excavated in 1972 and dating to the 1630s to the 1690s. Background research determined that the site was originally settled by Isaac Allerton in the late 1620s to early 1630s, and subsequently was the home of his daughter Mary and his son-in-law Thomas Cushman. Excavations by Dr. James Deeth from Plymouth Plantation identified at least 28 features, some of which appear to have been given feature numbers but were subsequently determined to be unworthy of further comment. Two sections of palisade trench, you can see those on the left. You can see one section on the left-hand side of the slide labeled feature 3, were also identified, as well as 3 corner post holes, 2 possible shed or lean-to post molds, another small post mold they didn't know what it was for, a cobble hearth, and an E-shaped series of sill and joint stains, all associated with the first occupation, which is believed to have begun as early as late 1620s, and associated with the Allertons, Prents, and early Cushman occupation. The cellar hole that you see in the center of this drawing, and a fence line slot trench that were associated with the second post-1675 occupation by the Cushmans. And there's no indication about how large that building would have been, but it was obviously on a different orientation. You can see the outline that's shown here on this slide is the outline of the original building. Excavation inside the cellar resulted in a recovery of a circa 1690 wine bottle, indicating it was filled after this time. Cellar hole excavation also revealed the identification of a stone hearth that had been barely cut by the southeast corner of the cellar hole. And you can see that as that kind of black blob in this slide on the right-hand side. It was aligned with the deep possible palisade trench, making it probable they were associated with that feature. Possibility that 2 houses were present at the same location was later confirmed when 4 large post molds measuring up to 10 inches in diameter were identified aligned with the hearth and a possible palisade trench. These posts outlined a house measuring 22 by 20 feet with a chimney located at the eastern or gable end. 3 smaller posts were located to the south of the house and interpreted as a shed attached onto this side of the house. The main structure appears to have been square with freeset posts set at the corners. The Waterman site in Marshfield is another important and more recent archaeological site that was excavated. Archaeological intensive survey and site examination testing was carried out prior to improvements at the town of Marshfield's George Harlow Field Airport in 2012. The surveys identified colonial archaeological remains that initially were believed to date to the 18th century. Interesting, but not too rare. But the surprise awaited the excavators when they returned the following year to carry out full-scale data recovery mitigation excavations, when it was discovered that the site actually represented a complete footprint of a home dating to the first half of the 17th century. Not only that, but the home was constructed using post-in-ground earth-fast construction, and, as an extra added bonus, was destroyed by fire after being occupied for maybe a decade at most. The site was determined to most probably be the Marshfield home of Robert Waterman, who lived from 1608 to 1652, and his wife Elizabeth Bourne Waterman, who lived from 1618 to 1663, and their children, with a possible occupation date being of 1638 to 1648 at the latest, so only 10 years maybe. Limited number of ceramic vessels and pipe stems recovered would argue for an even shorter period of occupation. So it seems like he built this house, it burned down, and then he moved after that. Most amazing thing about the house, aside from the vast amount of everyday occupation information preserved through the calamity of the fire, is the footprint of the building itself. It's interpreted as what would have been common as a cottage in the 17th century, representing the simplest form of dwelling built in early Plymouth colony. Interpretation of the architecture of the site shows a main part of the building measuring about 12 by 12 feet with a 5 by 12 extension on the north end, making it a total of 12 by 17 feet, just like the watch house that we talked about earlier, the Plymouth watch house. Posts were set 12 feet apart, and the shallow cellar hole, which you see up on the north end there, the top of the picture, shallow cellar hole only measured about 10.5 by 4 feet and was only 15 to 23 inches deep. Dimensions are very similar to the 1642 watch house, which is 16 by 12 feet, and is probably laid out very similar to the Waterman house. I wasn't involved with the excavation of those other sites, so I've analyzed the architecture and some of the artifacts. But this house here, I actually wasn't involved with the excavations. This is the Wing House down in Sandwich. The house was identified in 2014. It's hypothesized to have been constructed using free set posts for the main southern part and puncheon set construction for the northern addition, below which the cellar was situated, because the posts were closer together up there. The posts in the southern portion of the house are hypothesized to have been spaced about 10 feet apart, while those in the northern addition were spaced about 5 feet apart. It's hypothesized the wattle and daub framing was used for the duration of the occupation, and a brick hearth, or at least brick pintles, were added on the sides of the house at some point in the building's history. The house measures 18 feet east to west and at least 16 feet north to south, the main house posts being about 10 feet apart. The cellar hole measures 13 by 5 feet, 13 feet by 5 feet beneath an addition or shed, with these posts spaced about a meter apart around the cellar hole. Again, it's very similar to the Waterman house and to the description in 1642 of the Watch House in Plymouth. So we're looking at what may be the earliest forms of Plymouth Colony houses. Different than the houses that are at Plymouth Plantation or Plymouth Patuxent Museum nowadays, but similar to what UMass Boston actually found when they were excavating up on Burial Hill a couple of years ago. These small cottage houses with a cellar at one end. The RM site, or William Clark site, few architectural earth-fast structures had been excavated in Plymouth Colony, fewer than in Maine or in the Middle Atlantic or Southern colonies, where they're just everywhere. But those excavated show a range of sizes and techniques of construction. First post and ground house to be excavated, although not identified as such until years later, was the RM/William Clark home site in Plymouth. It's located on a knoll overlooking the Eel River on the property of Plymouth Patuxent Museum, and was built in the 1630s and destroyed in 1676 during King Philip's War. Clark was a merchant. There's an abundant evidence for trade with the natives: beads, scissors, knives, brass scrap, tobacco pipes, bale seals for cloth, as well as historical, other historical artifacts that indicate that they were doing a lot of trade at the site. And it was probably used as a trading house by Clark, who was a merchant, and also his residence, just like the houses in Maine. Excavations were carried out in the 40s by Plymouth Plantation's founder, Harry Hornblower, and later by Carl Fernstrom of Harvard University. In the 1960s, Dr. James Deet excavated at the site, and limited work was done near the house by Plymouth Plantation in the 1980s. Excavations revealed that William Clark's house was a longhouse form, measuring 54 feet east to west by 18 feet north to south. It had been constructed using the freeset post earth-fast technique, and evidence for the earth-fast construction was most visible in the western half, where a total of 5 post holes of varying depth were uncovered. No post holes were identified in the eastern half, but there were a series of 4 rock clusters identified in the field as piers, foundation piers for sills. It's not recorded that the foundation piers were excavated, but it is possibly represent the location of rotted posts that were later supported by stones. Post hole and foundation pier spacing appeared equal at the site, and both elements being spaced regularly at 9 feet center to center on the north and south sides, and 6 feet on the east and possibly west sides. 6 foot spacing on the east side may be related to the presence of a smoke hood at this end of the house, whereas the western side, there may have been only 1 post spaced 9 feet from the corners. Spacing creates a house that either had 3 bays that were 18 by 18, 2 bays that were 27 by 18, or an eastern bay measuring 27 by 18 and with a 9 by 18 cross patches and an 18 by 18 western room. That's a nice thing about archaeology. You can interpret things any way you want, as long as you put the facts in there to back up what your interpretation is. So lots of different ways to interpret this site here, but all in all, you can see from the outline that it's a long house with a cellar at one end and a hearth at the other end there. Which is very similar to this one in Maine. This was Cushnock. This was a trading house that was built by Plymouth Colony in 1628. It was constructed with bent set posts, so they were framed on the ground and then raised up. Overall dimensions are 20 feet wide by 44 feet long, with each bay being approximately 15 feet long and 20 feet wide. Intermediate posts set in between the middle of the long side of the center bay were interpreted as associated with a cross passage interior, very similar to what the interpretation at the Clark site could be. Posts set 3 to 4 feet east of the west end of the building was hypothesized as representing a support for a daubed fire hood associated with a hearth. No trace of burn soil remained associated with the location. 4 good archaeological examples of early Massachusetts hall and parlor houses are William Nickerson House in Chatham, John Howland House in Kingston, and the Ezra Perry House in Bourne. and the Richard and Ruth Taylor House in Yarmouth. We'll talk about those next. This is the William Nickerson site down in Chatham that we excavated over the course of several years. We tested and excavated over the course of several years. Original house measured about 26 feet long. Just give you a couple of bits of information about this house. The original house, you can see it right in the center there. It's that long rectangle. The clusters of stones, clusters of little red dots, those represent where the hearths are. The blue outline we to the south there, the southwest, we think represents a barn that had a cellar beneath it. And then the blue outline to the southeast, the smaller blue outline, we think represents a blacksmith forge where he was also trying to smelt bog iron at the site. So it's got lots of different things happening. And that those red lines you see going around the main building, right in the house, was a palisade that encircled the house. So it's a really amazing site that we're still writing up and presenting on. But it was a great site, great 17th century site, and a lot. It's a subject of many more talks. But anyway, the original house, we believe, measured about 26 feet by 18 feet wide. Based on a clay spread of the hearth, which may represent the collapse of the chimney, the building was probably a story and a half high. The front door may have been located on the southwest corner of the south wall, where the post holes are spaced closer together than they are further along the wall. The hearth at the eastern gable end was probably located within the parlor of the house. Another hearth on the eastern hearth must have been located along the north wall facing south into the house. So they had a little different setup for hearths in this structure here. Both hearths were made of wattle and daub construction, and the house would have divided into a hall on the western side and a parlor on the eastern side. It's believed that the original house, burned to some degree, resulting in burned debris that was located around the hearth. We had lots of artifacts and lots of evidence of the chimney. Then subsequently was rebuilt. An addition was made 14 feet long, extending along the original east wall further to the east. The eastern hearth was added at the time at the northeast corner of the addition's east wall. It was also wattle and daub, but it had brick walls within a hearth box itself. So if you were inside this parlor looking at it, it would look very nice because it had nice brickwork. But if you went outside and looked, it would be a wattle and daub chimney, maybe covered with clapboards on the outside. But from the inside, when you're in that parlor, that special room, it would look very nice inside of there. And then subsequently, there was another addition that was built on the backside of that house as well, making the overall house side 48 by 18 feet. It's pretty huge in terms of 17th century houses, especially on Cape Cod at the time. It was what we like to refer to as the first McMansion on Cape Cod. Due to the relative paucity of nails, we didn't find a lot of nails, especially smaller nails typically used for clapboards and shingles. It's possible the house was half timbered and thatched. Alternately, I propose it may have been removed after William's death. Maybe the timber was nice, Cape forested by the later 17th century, and it may have been removed. And as I was saying, you can reconstruct things sort of whatever way you want. You base it on the evidence that you have, but you have a lot of freedom when you're doing reconstruction. So if we did some sort of sketchy reconstructions for this house, and it could have looked something like that. You can see it clapboarded with a thatched roof and all three hearths in use at the same time, which is kind of a simple, sort of like a barn kind of house. Not super fancy, but yeah, it also may have had a shingled roof, wooden shingled roof like this, and the chimneys may have looked fancier. It may have had gables on it as well. It may have been a fancier looking house with possibly even two doors in it. We don't really know. We do what we can with the archaeology, but sometimes it's just left up to imagination. Now, the John Howland House up in Kingston was probably originally built by John Janney around 1633. It was excavated by Sidney Strickland in the 1930s. He uncovered a stone foundation for a house measuring about 17 and a half by 33 feet for the main house, with a 9-foot by 25-foot lean-to addition on the north side. A large stone chimney measuring about 13 by 5 feet was located on the west wall. Huge chimney. Upon John Howland's death in 1672, a probate was drawn up that gives a good indication of the layout of the building. The person charged with taking the inventory entered into the hall, referred to as a fire room in the probate, through the front door located on the south side of the house, where those large stones are, you see, concentrated together on the bottom side. The other room named in the probate was a parlor called the inner room. And you see it had the cellar there, but it was not like a full cellar that you could climb down through a hatchway. We think it was just sort of like a little depression on the back side of the house there, similar to what we saw at the Waterman house or at the Wing house as well. The Ezra Perry II house, also called the Patuxent Trading Post house, was built in Bourne, represents another kind of hall and parlor style house, similar to John Howland House, built in the later 17th century. It measures about 27.5 feet long by 25 feet 3 inches wide. It had a stone foundation and a hearth located on the east wall, measuring 8.9 by 7 feet. An addition measuring 21 feet east to west by 15 feet north to south was built on the east side of the house, probably as a storage or workroom in the 18th century. The Taylor Bray Farm down in Yarmouth was excavated by a team of professional archaeologists and volunteer excavators over the course of a number of years. And they determined it was the original Richard and Ruth Taylor house, measuring 18 feet, at least 18 feet north to south by 27 feet east to west. Gable ends are believed to have been located on the east and west sides, and the entrance would have been on the south side. The distribution of brick, charcoal, and tobacco pipe fragments provided strong evidence the chimney was probably located on the west wall, where you see that red rectangle. Using the evidence provided from the timbers of the original house, because at this site here, there's another house that's just to the north of this site. This archaeological site. It's a standing house, and we were able to go through that house when they were doing renovations of it, and found all these timbers that dated back to the 17th century. And they actually did some dendrochronological studies on some of the timbers, and some of them dated back to the 1630s. So what happened is that they took down this house and then reused it, because by the early 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century, there wasn't a lot of timber on Cape Cod again. And they reused it in that house there. And so they took things like the corner posts, and those became sills, or they took things like the rafters, and those became framing members around in other places of the house. So this is a really unique house, and we were able to actually use the evidence that we found in the standing house to reconstruct what the original house may have looked like. We concluded that the timbers there were about 2.5 stories tall from the ground floor, and the house was divided into 2 rooms. An eastern parlor that was painted with red milk paint and paneled, and a western hall that was whitewashed. The upstairs contained at least one chamber that was not whitewashed, that probably extended all the way to the roof peak. The building had been constructed by raising 3 bents, 27 feet wide from north to south, and seating them in 3 sets of deep post holes. At a later date, probably in the 18th century, an 18 by 18 foot addition was added to the northeast corner, possibly used as a buttery, milk house, or just a storage space. And then the cellar in it has the dimensions measuring 18 feet by 14 feet east and west. And we think that was probably added. That's the big rectangle you see in the center there, added in the 18th century. One final structure here we're going to talk about before we talk about the Alden House is the Duxbury Second Meeting House. Now, this is not 17th century. This is 18th century. It's located adjacent to the east end of the Miles Standish Burial Ground, which is America's oldest maintained cemetery. It's also, which is where the first meeting house is believed to be. When we did the excavations here, we found a total of 5 post holes, along with sill trenches where timbers would have been laid in these trenches in the ground that outlined the whole structure. The interesting thing is that we found that some of the post holes had been filled in with stone. The posts had been removed and the holes had been filled in with stone because the post had rotted, basically. And we thought it was very unusual to find a structure dating to the 18th century that was still using earth-fast construction. This meeting house was built in 1707. And we think the reason this happens may have been economic times in Duxbury and the expectations they had for the meeting house. In Duxbury, the use of the earth-fast architecture for the second meeting house may be interpreted as a response to financial constraints in the early 18th century, and possibly a plan to build a temporary meeting house that would serve the town needs until funds could be acquired to build a more permanent one. Due to the fact that the first meeting house was located in what would eventually become the Miles Standish Burial Ground, possibly hemmed in by 3/4 of a century of burials and generally in need of replacement, first meeting house could not be expanded or rebuilt, and a site was selected nearby. Possibly in an effort to reduce cost, earth-fast was selected as a method to be used to build it, with the idea being it would be replaced or at least upgraded over time. And this is in fact what occurred. Second meeting house was built in 1707. with 180 pounds being raised for the project. Following the original construction, resulting in a 30 by 40-foot structure, additions were continually made. In 1713, a seat was allowed to be built in it, and for the same year, a fence was built around it. Possible impermanence of the second meeting house may be evident when 25 years after it was built, it was found to be in need of repairs. In 1742, the rear was shingled. By 1745, the possibility of building a new meeting house was being discussed, but due to financial constraints, basically the town said, yeah, we great to build a new meeting house. If you'd like to pay for it, that's fine. Nobody came forth and wanted to pay for it. It was determined instead the structure should be enlarged with the work done at, quote, the cheapest rate, unquote. Once it was determined that the structure would remain, a pulpit was finally erected in 1752, and pews were added in 1754. They were auctioned off to raise money for the town. History of the meeting house indicates that after the structure had gotten to the point that it needed repairs, the town would have preferred to have built a new meeting house in 1745, but financially they could not, so they made do until 1785 when a new meeting house was eventually built. Now, the Alden House, excavations were carried out at the Alden archaeological site in the 1960s. The excavations were really limited to a cellar hole and to the stone areas that were found by probing. And the excavator came to the conclusion that the building's dimensions were 38 by 10 and a half feet. That's the overall dimensions of the foundations, from the outside of the foundations, which is, it's very different than the other architecture we've seen. As we've gone through this, we've seen some longhouses similar to this, but it doesn't quite match up with what we'd expect in the 17th century. And if you do a reconstruction of what the floor plan may have looked like, you can see that a hearth constructed there, of any size that you can actually make use, that's the rectangle in the center there, is going to take up a lot of space in the middle of a house and not give you a lot of space to actually enter the house. Sills were approximately a foot thick, let's say, on all sides. So you have a building that's 30, and these sills are what the studs for the windows and the carrying posts of the roof and the second story or loft would have been set. This reduces the interior space, living space, to about 8.5 feet north to south by 36 feet east to west. And the actual stone foundations, I think, were found to be about 18 inches. So it even smaller than the 8.5 feet by 36 feet. The hearth, where they hypothesized the hearth could be, if it was in the center, where they found some brick smears, it'd be facing east with another one facing west, a typical arrangement for a hall and parlor house. It's a real reason for having a hearth in the center of your house anyway. If you measured it at least 6 feet on a side, it makes the house, the entrance to the house, very small. So you're only talking about maybe 2.5 feet when you enter into the house to be able to enter in and turn and enter into either the hall or the parlor. If you had, like, say, a 5-foot hearth, a 5-foot chimney block, then the hearth space could only be maybe 3 feet, very small for the 17th century. What does it represent? We're not really sure. I mean, John Alden was a gentleman. He was an assistant. He was a master. He was referred to as master. He was a rich person in Plymouth Colony. It seems very strange that he would be living in such a teeny tiny small house like this. So there may be more traces of a building around this that just need to be found, basically. Earth-fast construction was probably the first form of European architectural tradition used in Plymouth Colony. It offered stability, simple framing, limited durability, and at least enough to get you through a decade or so you could build something more permanent. As you can see, this is framing for a timber frame structure. It has lots of timbers. This is a simple earth-fast structure here. Many fewer members, many fewer main principal members with lots of little things stuck in there that you can kind of make do with whatever you have. May have even evolved into the plank frame structures, which have had even fewer framing members and substitute a strong box-like structure for all the braces. So basically what it comes down to is that it seems that the earliest Plymouth Colony architecture was those small cottages that were described in the historical documents than we have evidence of archaeologically at a couple of different sites, and that there may have been those longhouses that were used for trading purposes and for people who were merchants. And then eventually it seems like everybody really wanted to move into a nice big hall and parlor house. That's what people who are well off and people who, wanted to show off their wealth basically in the 17th century would have built. Thank you for your time.
Oh, Craig, thank you for that. Just fascinating glimpse at these early houses. And I have to say, as you were describing the Alden house, that's even less room for those 10 children to be able to grow up in that tiny abode. But anyway, I know we have a lot of questions that are coming in. And just to get started, from Janet in Duxbury, very close to home here. She wanted to know what the oldest standing 17th century house is that you.
The oldest confirmed one that I know of is it dates to the 1660s, and it's the Churchill House in downtown Plymouth. That's the oldest standing house that we know of that's been confirmed through dendrochronological evidence. There's been other houses like the Sparrow House in Plymouth that's claimed to have been built in 1640, but there's no hard and firm evidence about it being about it dating to that date. So as far as we know, the oldest standing one in Plymouth Colony, what's now Plymouth Colony, is the Churchill House down there in Plymouth.
And can you give us a description for those of us who are local and want to go go check it out, where that's located?
It's a private home. It's a private family home, so you can drive by it. It's right up near Jordan Hospital. If you are driving down, what's that? The main street that goes south through Plymouth down towards Plymouth Plantation, the Sandwich Road. Is that what that is? I'm not sure. It's that main street. When you go down, there's an intersection where Bradford Liquors used to be. And then there was a 7-Eleven on the other corner. If you take the right there and head up towards Jordan Hospital, as you get up to the top of the hill, you'll see the Churchill House on your left-hand side. You can't miss it. It looks like a nice 17th century house. So.
Thank you very much for that. Another question came in as to why houses faced south, and that's certainly something that we get from visitors because both the Alden houses were faced that way.
Yeah, most 17th century houses that I know of face south. It all has to do with the fact we live in New England and we get a lot of snow. When you have a house that's facing south, you're more likely to have that winter sun melting the snow from in front of your house and keeping the south side of your house warmer than the north side. And that's why they'd often put the dairies or places where you want to keep things cool on the north side of the houses. That way they'd stay cool even in the summertime, because in the summertime, the south side is also the warmest side, but the north side is still the coolest side in the summer. So they did it for very practical reasons. So if you see a house that doesn't align correctly with the roads that are around it, the modern roads that are around it, most likely it's an older house that was built to take advantage of that that winter sun.
So another question came in regarding the use of thatch and fire, and how the pilgrims and the early settlers adjusted their building practices, based on those issues.
Yeah, I mean, thatch is an easy way to cover a roof, basically. The only problem with it, of course, is that it's very flammable. So eventually, Plymouth Town itself made a law saying that in Plymouth itself, you could not have a roof that was thatched. Obviously, they had some fires that burned down a number of buildings, so you had to have a boarded roof in Plymouth itself. But that did not stop people from building thatched, houses with thatched roofs outside of Plymouth Town proper. And thatched roofs exist in England and have existed in England for hundreds of years. And there's thatched roofs in England that are, 400 years old, 500 years old. They're maintained. There's new layers of thatch that are added onto it. And from what I've heard from people who are actual thatchers who are from England, they said it's a good medium to cover your roof with. It has to be maintained, and you have to be careful with your fire that's inside of it. So.
And
probably.
another question, you mentioned, of course, the fair and pleasant houses, and we just love that real estate's assessment of houses in the very early part of the colony. But when you think about what the others, what they were being compared to, do you think that some of those were perhaps some of those that might have been built underground, partially underground? And if you could comment a little bit on that building practice.
Yeah, I know the building practice did happen in other places. Um, where was it? I can't remember. There was a record from New Jersey or Pennsylvania or somewhere down that way that talks about them building houses in the ground basically and framing them up. And it's when I worked at Plymouth Plantation years ago, we had a couple of houses that were built in the ground. We call them the hovels, and they weren't bad. The only problem was they flooded really easily because they were located on the hill. So there's no evidence of it archaeologically or documentary wise here in Plymouth Colony. Um, but I guess it is something that could have been built early on, possibly. They're really neat to see. They're neat to go inside. They're neat to experience. Like I said, at the plantation when I worked there, we had them. But factually, we don't really have any evidence of them being around here. But like I said, I do remember somewhere else they talked about houses either being built into the ground or dug into the side of a hill, and people living in those.
So another question came in regarding any Native American influence on building styles for the early Plymouth settlers.
As far as we know, I can't think of any kind of any kind of influence that went from the Native Americans to the English. There was an English visitor here named William Wood who wrote a book in the 17th century. And he talked about the native houses, and he said the houses were nice and warm. He said they were warmer than the English houses. Um, but the problem was they were very smoky. He said you couldn't stand up in a native house, at least in the native house that he visited. Said you had to sit down because the way they were constructed without a chimney, that the smoke would be right at eye level basically, and so the only way you could be inside of them would be to sit down. But I've never heard of any kind of influence, of the native houses, the round houses, or the longer houses, um, being something that people, at least in Plymouth Colony, ever chose to pick up on. And quite honestly, I mean, people who are coming over here, the colonists who came over here were, they were pretty prejudiced in their ideas about what they wanted to do. They didn't come over here to, you know, try to adapt to the world. They wanted to make the world adapt to them. They wanted to make New England into England, just like old England. And you want to build exactly what what you're comfortable with, and what's going to be most familiar to you. And probably even if they did see any advantages to the native houses, they wouldn't have incorporated them because it's not English. They were very prejudiced in that sense.
So from Daniel, have you seen any evidence for board and batten roofs? And it's a three-part question. So
Um, I have not seen any, but in any of the standing buildings that I know of, there's no reason why they couldn't have existed. I just haven't seen them. Um, like I said, in any of the buildings that I know of, but that's also possibly because the roofs are probably replaced pretty often. In a house that's like the Alden House, the standing Alden House there, I'm sure that roof must have been replaced over time because they're exposed to the weather and they rot out. So it's a possibility they could have existed, but I just haven't seen them.
So as a second part of his question is, do you have any idea as to the first known paint used on walls or posts in the region? And if you could also comment a little bit maybe on the painting of the exterior of these houses.
As far as we know, they did not paint the exteriors of the houses in the 17th century. They were just left natural, like the Alden houses. On the inside, they would do a number of different kind of painting styles. They would whitewash, using a lime wash. That was done to make things nice and white and clean. It also reflects the light, so it makes the interior of your house brighter, especially in the kitchen areas. I worked at an Amish farm up in upstate New York for a while, and every year they'd whitewash the walls inside the milking house up there to make it brighter and whiter, and it definitely worked. So that's something they did do. We also know there was a house down in Sandwich 17th century house in Sandwich that was still standing, and inside of there they had the ceiling whitewashed, but they also had the main beams painted black. So it was a real nice contrast on the inside. And then that down at Taylor Bray Farm, the wainscoted walls that were from the 17th century, they were painted red. Some people call it oxblood red. I'm not sure if it actually did come from oxblood, but it may have been like an iron oxide paint that was used to paint the walls there to make them red. And sometimes they'd also do sort of a circle sponge decoration on the ceilings inside the house. That's something else that also shows up, and sometimes even on the walls, so almost like a polka dot, like a Dalmatian pattern on the walls and on the roofs of the ceilings of your house.
And another question, do you have any idea what sort of pails the Nickerson's house palisade might have had?
Yeah, we actually found some of the palisade posts actually in the ground still, and we were able to look at them. They were, they were fairly substantial. The pieces that we found, they were preserved because the ground was sort of wet down there, and they appear to have been round logs, and they appear to have been made out of cedar. So they were cedar logs. So they must have gone to a cedar swamp that was local down there, and cut these cedar logs and just used them. They just dug a deep trench and just stuck them in right next to each other. And then they may have had a piece of wood going across horizontally above that to kind of hold them together. But they were buried, 3, almost 4 feet in the ground, so they probably weren't going too far. And the whole palisade probably measured maybe 8 feet high. So.
So I think another question, certainly from Mark related to the Alden House, but I think it certainly pertains to many of these structures and their size with the large families that they had. Just a comment on how, these families would have managed in these very small structures, with, almost living on top of each other.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much what it was. They were kind of living on top of each other. I mean, you had beds that you could put away, but if you were someone of wealth, someone of substance, and you had that parlor, that's where the mother and father, the husband and wife, that's where they would sleep. That was their private room, basically. And then the children could have beds that could be, their mattresses that could be put away, either upstairs in a upper chamber, or if it was a smaller house, they might have a loft. Like if you go to Plymouth Plantation, Plymouth Patuxent museums nowadays, some of the houses have lofts in there, and children could get up there at night and sleep up there on the floors, on a straw bed or a bed full of ticking or something like that. And then the beds are just kind of rolled up or brought outside in the summertime, and put on the fences or whatever to air out in the summertime. But I think I just always imagine it would have been very crowded inside these houses at night. And then daytime, it would be nice and open because things are put away. But at nighttime, you'd have a hard time not stepping on someone, I think, in some of these houses.
Well, I think they always joke about being warmer in the winter because of that, but
There you
yeah.
go. Yep.
Um, so I think we're getting close to our time, so I want to be just respectful of everyone's lunch hour here. Any final comments that you'd like to add?
One of the things that I was thinking about too that I forgot to mention about the Alden house, is that when I was looking at John Alden's probate inventory, it seems like he didn't have a lot at that time. They don't mention his house, or any of his lands, and so I was wondering. I don't know if you have any insight into it about whether or not he may have been living inside the house, the standing John Alden house at the time of his death. That he may have moved into that house, and they could have actually taken apart the Alden house that was out there, in the field, the archaeological site, taken that apart and used parts of it inside that house, and that's why it resulted with the tons and tons of stones that were found, and the tons of bricks that were found, and all the nails. It's just all the leftover pieces. I know that they have done some dendrochronological work at the house and didn't really find anything that dated way back, but for what I've seen, there's pieces of old houses hidden inside of old houses all the time, and maybe they just didn't find the timbers that were the oldest ones, or didn't find the ones they could actually date. So
Right.
that was just one thing that I had thought of that I hadn't had a chance to mention. So there's a possible. I was wondering about the possibility that John Alden could have actually passed away inside that house that you have standing there now.
Well, it is, it is possible. I mean, it does seem that they did dismantle that earlier house site. It
Yeah.
also seems that he may have distributed, Priscilla had predeceased him, so that he had distributed some of his, maybe possessions to the other, sort of settled them on his children because he was about 89,
Hmm.
before he finally passed. So that story is still to be discovered. And we keep
Thanks so
working
much.
on it. Yes. Yeah.
That's
But
great.
thank you, Craig. This has been
Thank you.
absolutely fascinating. We are recording this talk, so we will be posting it on the Eldon website. Encourage you to come and visit the museum when we reopen again this June. And keep checking out our programs at alden.org. Craig, thank you again for a wonderful afternoon.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. This is great.
All right. Goodbye,
All right.
everyone. Thank you.
Goodbye.